Ryan is coming.
He's here.
He's here. Is he here? Oh, yeah, he's here.
Oh, yeah, I just don't want to, I mean, the sign's going to take 2 minutes.
Okay, we got 2 out of 10. Speak loudly.
I think that's my problem at the time. Go, you're all set?
I'm set.
Everyone's all set? Oh, wait. We can take everyone's, can I have everyone's attention just for a moment? If you can take out your cell phone, handheld personal devices, they have to be powered off, not silent or any other mode other than powered off. If you're speaking this evening, we ask that you please sign
I
in.
don't understand.
I don't either, sorry.
Turn that thing off.
If you're speaking this evening, we ask that you please sign in. We also ask that if you have any discussions with one another, please take it in the hallway. It interferes with those that are speaking before us that we can hear them. We're going to always be courteous and most certainly appropriate with one another through this entire process. And if asked, we ask that you please listen to direction not only of the board but of council and those that are moving forward to try to make this process as smooth as possible. We're going to start this evening's meeting with first a motion to open. Motion,
Make a
please.
motion that we open this meeting of the Board of Architecture Review and Historic Preservation on August 28th, 2017.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Welcome to the August 28th, 2017 meeting of the Architectural Board of Review and Historic Preservation. My name is Curtis Highsmith, and I'm your chair. I'd like to introduce our panel for this evening. We have Brian Grady, along with Christina Redding, Susan Stevenson, as well as Jeff Broadleib. We are expecting our historic consultant, Zach Studenroth. We do have our legal counsel, Bill Robinson, and we will always, as always, love to welcome you as well. We're going to start this evening's meeting with first signs and first application, please.
First application is Morrison Sons.
Is the applicant present? It's a window sign, decal, the established name of the company. It looks like a logo and clothing store. I don't see any issue or challenges with the actual window sign
it's very
itself.
well
Doesn't
done.
seem okay. Any issue? Any questions? Any questions about the window sign?
No, it's up.
Motion to. Is there any public comment before we move further? Motion to approve the window
I
sign.
make a motion that we approve the sign on Main Street for Morrison Sons.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Next application, please.
Next application is Fernando Wong Outdoor Living Design.
Ooh.
Is the applicant present? Yes. Please step forward. Yes. Your name for the record, please.
Carrie Holt.
Okay. Is this going to be a contractor sign?
Contractor sign.
It's going to be on a site or lot that you're doing work?
Yes.
Okay. Name of the company, Outdoor Living, and a telephone number. There's no website, there's no other detail, correct?
That's the sign.
Board members, any questions? Any issues? Any concerns?
No.
Contractor sign?
Nope.
Any
Nice.
comment by the public? Motion to approve?
I make a motion that we approve the sign for Fernando Wong Outdoor Living Design.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next application, please.
Next application is Sugoyani Kala Architect.
Well pronounced.
Was it?
I have no idea.
Thank you anyway.
Name for the record.
Stacy Menzer, Hampton Signs.
Contractor sign?
Yes.
Name of the architect, I'm assuming a site that they're currently participating in? So rendering along with color of a sample color swatch,
Yes.
bright font,
Yes.
red background, white lettering.
Yes.
There's no telephone number, just the website.
Yes.
Board members, any question?
No. Fine.
Nope, nope, it's fine.
Any public comment on the application? Motion to approve.
I make a motion that we approve the sign for Siko Gnani Kala Architect.
Second.
Talk to Brian.
He did
Talk
a
to
better
Brian.
job.
All in favor?
Aye.
And final sign application for the evening.
Hampton Photo Arts, Inc.
We need this.
Okay, this is going to go on top of the building itself, correct?
Yes.
You have fine, custom framing, photo services, and supplies, name of the company itself. Any lighting, any type of lighting
No.
being proposed? Nothing at all?
Nothing at
The actual material of the sign is?
PVC.
Okay, and the lettering is?
Vinyl.
Correct. Decals, white background, black lettering?
I'm sorry, one more time?
White background, black lettering?
Yes.
Any board members, any questions?
No.
No, and we need a store like this now. Ellis Brothers is
No, that's
gone.
fine, yep.
Any public comment on the application? Motion to approve.
I make a motion that we approve Hampton Photo Arts Inc. sign on Windmill Lane.
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a good evening.
You too. That concludes our sign permits for this evening. First application, historic, is still adjourned until September 25th, 2017. We did send a letter out, correct? Sent just correspondence that they would have to post remailed.
Didn't send anything out myself first, but I think they're in line to be here on the
25th.
25th. Wayne is involved in that, and he may, either one of his partners will be here or some other firm.
Understood. So that open adjournment still stands. Next application, please.
Next application is SH24 LLC and SH28 LLC.
Good evening. For the applicant, John Bennett, Bennett Reed, 212 Windmill Lane, Southampton, New York. And with me this evening is my associate Bailey Larkin, Ed Hollander from Hollander Design, Natasha Jarek, and Richard Hayes from Tim Haynes' office, who's the project architect. This was a process which was started with a filing in November. Been through a total redesign, moved the house back 80 feet from the ocean, significantly lowered roof heights, and just a tad of procedural history before I ask Natasha and Ed to come up and present. So at the last meeting, well, actually, it's the meeting before the last meeting. It was interesting because Mr. Studenroth's comments were very positive. Then Mr. Studenroth followed that at the last meeting with a very positive report. There were positive reports from board members. And then, this is the meeting before the last meeting. I'm reading from a transcript. Very well, at this point, we'll adjourn pending review by the building department to be heard at our next meeting. That's Chairman Highsmith. Before that, Chairman Highsmith stated, we're saying, based on information now that's been given both by the applicant and by the opposition, reviewing it all and saying we have enough information. The only thing left is the retaining wall. So I did come to the last meeting, and there was, I presented a building permit for the retaining wall, and then there was a request from Mr. Foster to write a letter about the retaining wall, and I believe you have that in your file, in which other findings Mr. Foster makes is that since the retaining wall is not visible from a public street, there is no need for a certificate of appropriateness. This shouldn't come to the board's surprise, because the board did, when there was a request back in December 14th of 2015 to demolish those buildings that were at the old McKnight property, the board actually factored in this application as the obfuscation,
I think it's obfuscation, but
obfuscation, excuse me. I've known that word for a long time. It seems to be stumbling over it. The obscuring of the buildings from a public right-of-way. So the finding has been that, of course, which is as per the building inspector's purview, that this wall is not subject to the jurisdiction of the board because it is not visible from a public right-of-way. But even the road giving access to these houses is a common driveway. It's not even a private road. So, and then Mr. Foster goes on to correct some other misinformation in the record, and I give you that for your review. Part of the record, I think we've more than adequately dealt with the wall situation, which, quite frankly, to me has always appeared to be just a distraction. Now, so at the meeting before last, it was apparent to me, and the record bears it out, that the only thing that was requested was some clarification on the wall. We have that now. I was quite surprised at the last meeting to see that that there had been a request. Now remember, the roof heights have been lowered, and the house has been moved back 80 feet. I was surprised to see that there was a request that there could be some additional shortening of the house. I, not surprisingly, objected to that, because in the prior meeting, the board had stated that everything was in the record except the request for clarification on the wall, which you now have, and which I feel was clarified at the last meeting by a presentation of the certificate of occupancy, rather the building permit to you. But in any event, as per the board's request, I did, with some trepidation, approach both the architect and the applicant to see whether or not there could be any movement in terms of shortening the house, and Natasha will explain this to you, but we have shortened the house by 23.5 feet. And again, this is more than a gesture. It's an attempt to move this application along. You know, it's been my position all along, and it's not only my position, it's the board's position as adopted in board's actual findings in other cases, that you have no jurisdiction over a parcel that complies with the zoning setbacks. But nevertheless, we have further reduced the house to 23.5 feet. I'm going to ask Natasha and Ed to present
I'm just going to share that. My name is Natasha Jarek. So since last time, we took notes and comments from the community. We spoke to John Bennett and the client, and we did shrink the overall building by 23.6 feet.
You can lay that flat on the table so that the camera can pick up the,
I'm going to do it here.
you have to flip it around.
Is that good? Okay. So the way we did it, two moves that we did. One is that we kind of reconfigured this section of the house a little bit. So now it's 10 feet less long, and it's narrower, so that we could keep the garage happening as well here. So we have 4 spots. The other move was that now the connector is not as long, so we took sections out of the connector, and we shifted the garage. The garage is, the passage through is no longer on center with the entry door. We thought it might not be as necessary since you were kind of driving through. So the car is in motion. It's not necessary that, eye is always in flux. So we thought shifting it over would also allow this area to breathe a little bit more, and would allow this to appear this as a detached building connector and keep the concept that we had before. So that overall allowed us to, from the overall building length, the garage is now 23.6 feet moved south. All this section was compressed towards the south. So as far as plan-wise, I think that kind of describes those changes. In the elevations, we had hip dormers. Now we replaced it with shed dormer and a small flat roof dormers on both ends. We reduced the window size on this wing. That was a request from the neighbors that we reduce the window size. So that's another revision we made. So now, as you see the connector, the garage and the building are closer together. This effectively is smaller. I think from the back as well. And, again, this was fully compressed by 23.6 feet. And then the last, another revision that was requested that we do, which we did, we didn't see it problematic. We had a shingle stair enclosure in the back. It was brought to our attention that they thought we should change materials or make it more open. When we met with Michael Goldblum, it was agreed that we will change it to the shiplap and make it more fluid in this area. And I can pull up that elevation too. So this used to be shingles, now it's just shiplap with colonnade. So in this move, we also reduced the overall building area. Now we're at, by probably 800 to 1,000 square feet. Now we're at 14.5. We were at 15.2. I think these are really all the changes that we made from the last time. We set back, and I think the garage really helped us. Moving the garage to the east a little bit helped alleviate the length and allowed us to compress it a bit more. So we're happy with what we have right now as well. So,
So you're saying these changes were more...
Not a sacrifice, you're saying.
Excuse me?
well, it's always a challenge to have a critique and sit back and look at a project from another view. So we don't want to compromise the aesthetics and our ideas, but we do want to take into consideration if something is valid and it helps us develop the design better. Of course, we'll sit back and think about it and see how we can implement it. So I think that's really what we tried to do this time around.
Thank you.
And then there was also a request for Mr. Hollander to provide some more detail on the landscaping plan. That's been done. It's been in the office, filed, and available for everyone. Again, my understanding is that all the board members have either seen it or have an opportunity to see it. I'll ask Ed to come forward. Ed, can you some help?
I always need help. Good evening. My name is Edmund Hollander. We're the landscape architect for the project. Since we're kind of the new kids on the block, I thought I would present the board with some credentials that show kind of who we are and what we've done. I was an undergraduate history major at Vassar. I studied horticulture at the New York Botanical Gardens for 2 years before I got my master's degree in landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. The firm we started in 2001, so we've been doing this for a while now. In 2014, I was appointed to the Dean's Council at the University of Pennsylvania. We've won the Hamptons and Cottages Innovation and Design Award. We've won awards from the New York and the Connecticut chapters of the American Institute of Architects. We won the 2013 Stanford White Award from the Institute of Classical Architecture. I was awarded the Charles Armstrong Award for Lifetime Achievement in Landscape Design. We've won 3 national honor awards from the American Society of Landscape Architects, and in your booklet there are some of the 18 awards we've won from the New York chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Just so I'm not a guy they found on the street with trees, I wanted you to know that we have done this. What I also prepared in there was something I said, I realized we'd done a fair amount of work in the immediate vicinity of this project, and one of the plans that you have and what shows here, all of the projects outlined in yellow, which are in the immediate vicinity of this project, are houses that we've done in this portion of the village of Southampton. So we care about this. We didn't identify, I realized, the actual site, but I figured everybody here probably knew where the site was pretty well at this point. We didn't have to identify that. So that's just context to show that we are familiar with the area, we're familiar with the community, and everything we try to do within the village, whether it's on Ox Pasture or Great Plains or Meadow or Gin or Meadowmere or Wyandanch, whatever street, we want it to be a positive addition to the community. I take that very seriously as a responsibility that our landscape work doesn't belong just to our clients, but it also belongs to part of the community and the neighborhood. When we were asked to prepare a site plan and a landscape plan, this is what Natasha had presented, and so we went and put forth and prepared a landscape plan for this that identifies in large terms all of the existing trees on the site which are healthy and desirable and have been protected and preserved. And we also then show on the planting plan the various species of trees that we would propose to plant here and the sizes of those trees, understanding the fact that we are adjacent to the ocean and we have environmental conditions that need to be understood and adapted for. So our shade trees are what we would expect to find in this community and exist on neighboring properties, including there are lindens, which are very salt tolerant, and plane trees, which are salt tolerant, and elms, which are salt tolerant. Crepe myrtles do wonderfully well here. We have willows on the site. We're proposing additional flowering trees such as crepe myrtles and crab apples and Kwanzan cherries that like to grow here, so that the site itself becomes part of the larger context of the area along Gin Lane and as part of this area, so that it fits in and it becomes a welcome member of the community from a landscape point of view.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation of all your credentials. You've been before us enough. We do recognize your work and appreciate the time.
Just wanted to clear up one or two things. It's consistently been said that this is the largest house in the village or in the area. We demonstrated with facts, not conjecture, that this is not true. It's also been said it's a very long house, it's the longest house, and that's simply not true. 16 Gin Lane, which is the Waldron Manor, it's 200 feet. 170 Meadow Lane, which is the Sugarman House, is 357 feet long. And, there's been talk about the fact that, you have these relatively smaller houses to the east. So, for example, 170 Meadow, Sugarman, to the east of 170 Meadow, which is Sugarman, are those two, I've always known them as the twin houses. They don't look quite so twin now. One used to be Verona's. Those are about 95 feet long. The question is how it sits on the site. 160 Ox Pasture, which is Jürgen Friedrich's house, 200 feet. 155 Hill Street, which is a gem, of course, that's the Stanford White. It was started as a house. Now I think it's 4 condominium units. That's 260 feet long. 1280 Meadow, 225 feet. 1320 Meadow, 267 feet. 1610 Meadow, 183 feet. 80 Wyandanch, 200 feet. 140 Gin, 160 feet. 20 Meadow, 212 feet. 28 Gin is our property. So it's just...
Perhaps to say we're just about there would be a fair statement with a few other considerations that this board may consider. At the outset, however, there was a letter that was forwarded to the board. I take it that the board reflected on that. I would suggest respectfully that the matter be adjourned pending the reflection on that letter. And if the board is so inclined, I think that would be appropriate. If not, then we'll proceed.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And you would have the exception as to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
There are a couple of, to say zoning questions, if indeed zoning is the standard, and we believe that a mere as-of-right presentation is not the standard, that this board has the complete discretion whether or not a building is in compliance with zoning standards or not to make an evaluation. But nevertheless, a few of the zoning issues are popping up on this latest plan, which, by the way, was only filed, I believe, on August 25th. Of course, one has a limited opportunity, especially in the summer, to gather the forces to come and evaluate something. So unfortunately, this evaluation is not complete. Mr. Goldblum was unable to make it today, and of course, his very intelligent, informed comment would be better than mine, but nevertheless, I'll try to substitute for him. One concern with the revised plan is the failure to honor the side yard requirements. I believe that there is a total combined side yard requirement of 80 feet.
Excuse me, why are we discussing zoning? This is the Architectural Review Board.
Yes, we are. And this board, there's been no application for a zoning variance, and in the event that the proposal exceeds the side yard requirements, perhaps that's an issue that could be adjusted right here rather than have an extended application elsewhere before another board.
There's a question about zoning. Well, we have no jurisdiction. There's a question about side yard setback. There's a question about zoning. That's the appropriate department to start your inquiry would be the building
The point is simply this, that the evaluation of this plan reflects that the side yard, the 80-foot combined side yard is violated depending upon whether you're looking at the structure or the pool house or the garage, anywhere between 3 to 5.5 feet. We ask that the board take that under advisement, and perhaps a recommendation for an adjustment might resolve that problem.
The handler must not be aware of the potential for non-conforming lots. Maybe you read the code.
As to the pool house, the same issue exists with respect to the height. That is approximately 1 foot higher than the height permitted, and we ask the board to look at that. Again, this may be a place to have an agreed upon adjustment rather than extending the application further. The objectants had hoped that there would be full floor plans and elevations with respect to the pool house. We haven't seen those. We don't know whether or not they have been filed, and we ask that they be submitted before the board make a final determination. A great concern is the porch at the southeast corner of the property. It appears that there may be a wraparound component on that porch. We really can't tell whether that's just some articulation as it wraps around on the southeast side. Nevertheless, we'd ask the board to confirm whether or not that is actually a porch or just articulation. There's a glass railing that is connected to that porch. It's out of line with a historic structure. We'd ask the board reflect on that glass railing. It seems inappropriate, and since the board certainly has the function of evaluating appropriateness, to take a closer look at that. Thank you. The corner of the eastern roof line appears to be in violation of the sky plane. We ask that the board take a look at that. The retaining wall constitutes a concern. There may have been a plan that was submitted, and thank you if that was. The objectants take the position that the fill of the retaining wall is noted on the west side, but it's not reflected as to the extent of the fill on the east. Council indicates that the retaining wall can't be seen from the street, and therefore it doesn't require this board's certificate of appropriateness. However, there'll be plantings and fencing on top of that wall, and to that extent, the raising of the retaining wall has an impact on the height, and therefore we believe a certificate of appropriateness should be required for that. Also, the details with respect to the fill, especially on the eastern side of the retaining wall, are a serious question, and the details of that, together with an environmental impact statement, would be appropriate to provide this board with a full picture. The tennis court on the 24 Gin Lane appears as well to have a side yard violation. We ask that the board take a closer look at that. Again, not to act as a zoning appeal board, but rather if that violation could be mitigated, perhaps a slight tweaking would have the opportunity of addressing it now rather than prolonging the application. We appreciate very much the effort by the architects who met with Mr. Goldblum. That was very gentlemanly and productive. And especially appreciate the reduction of the length of the house by 23.5 feet. The hope was, however, that that 23.5-foot reduction would take place at the south portion of the property, of the structure, rather than at the northerly portion. And the hope is that by moving the house back 23.5 feet and putting it in line with the northerly edge of the Menger pool, that would resolve many of these issues and perhaps bring the parties to a final accord. This board sits in the historic preservation context. Its function is well delineated under Chapter 65, and this board knows your criteria and your rules far better than me. In the end, what we're seeking here as a community, as well as the party, is a question of appropriateness and compatibility. We respectfully ask that the board keep those ideas in mind, and I know that you have and continue to do so, and also pay attention to the black letter rules provided in the Secretary of Interior requirements with respect to its guidelines with regard to rehabilitations, as well as the Secretary's standards. There are additional elements that are set forth in those standards which go well beyond the listing of the criteria set forth in the Village Code, and we respectfully request that the board take a look at those as well. Finally, if the board determines that the matter would be closed as of this evening, and before making any determination, we would request an opportunity to submit memoranda, since it wasn't until today that the final plan would be discussed, and that the board grant a sufficient period of time for that submission for the board's review.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Was there something else, Lynn, that you wanted me to? Thank you.
Any additional public comment? Nothing further? Okay. Zach, I know you did a report prior. I just want to make sure that we are on record discussing some of the concerns that were just addressed this evening. Did you have any comments as our historic consultant to the nature of the material, the design, the mass, the scale of the now proposed and reduced home structure that's being proposed?
Well, I submitted just a two-page summary of my feelings about it, and this wasn't presented at the last meeting, was it? Forgive me, my memory is beginning to fail.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
The meeting before.
Well, not the meeting. No.
No.
11, so I know I'm not that far out of step. The only further comment I want to make, there is a misconception which I think is relevant to this application and others pertaining to new construction in the historic district. And all of this gets rather arcane, I suppose. But what's important to realize is the Secretary standards that have been referenced apply to work that is being undertaken in the rehabilitation or work upon pre-existing historic structures. In other words, those buildings which are considered to be contributing within a historic district or which are listed individually on the National Register. And the Secretary of the Interior standards specifically addressed what we might call as best practices in the work on these historic structures. They do not have an application specifically, or really at all, to new construction within a historic district. New construction is really looked at from a different viewpoint. It is it compatible, et cetera, in terms of scale, detailing, mass, and all those criteria. But I think this creeps in as a slight misconception that those Secretary of the Interior standards are equally applied to entirely new construction within the district, as opposed to that which is being done to a pre-existing structure. So I think that's just something to kind of generally remember, because it's come up several times in this application, and I think that's simply a misunderstanding of what those standards mean and under what conditions they are to be applied. So, just wanted to say that. But my earlier report sums it up. I did want to say I noticed something this evening in the slight revisions that have been proposed that perhaps I hadn't noticed before, but it goes to the impact of the scale and the massing of what's proposed. And that is that it appears that the ridge line of the roof, of the garage roof is lower than the north extension, which in turn is lower than the main block of the house. In my view, originally, I had thought that that lower ridge line was continuous along the north extension and indeed across it into the garage. It appears as if the garage is in fact lower, and I think that goes to this sort of the impact, the overall impact of the design, which is that the massing of it is arranged such that it very intentionally attempts to scale down these components, and all that's part of the approach to this. So it further minimizes the impact of the house as you approach it, and that may be the same as before, but I noticed a slight difference there to the good. So in other words, the massing of that garage section is even lower, consistent with that sort of design approach. That's all I noticed this evening. So that's it.
There's still an open question, well, at least a comment this evening, specifically, even though there was
reality, from field inspections and measurements, the retaining wall is an average height of between 22 plus inches to 27 plus inches from the north end of the retaining wall to a height of 3 feet 9 inches at the south end. Total length 400 linear feet plus or minus. If exterior aesthetics are important, the retaining wall has an exterior of earth-colored stones and a continuous stone cap. In addition, on top of the area next to the stone wall is a replanted 8-foot privet hedge with an interlaced 6-foot-high open wired green fence. This fence is hard to see even when you are standing right next to it. Also on the west side of the retaining wall along the bottom is a new 4-foot-high privet hedge that screens out the retaining wall. On the east side of the retaining wall is another 4-foot-high privet hedge at the bottom of the 8-foot-high privet hedge. The new residents at 28 Gin Lane will need, in some areas, 3 feet of fill for compliance with FEMA. This will eliminate the east berm effect of the retaining wall, which is a landscape feature, not a berm. There will be required areas that will have drainage installed to protect the owner as well as the neighbors prior to a certificate of occupancy being issued to 28 Gin Lane. If you should have any further questions, please contact me. Sincerely, Jonathan B. Forster, Building Inspector.
Okay. So that's the response that we've been waiting for last couple of meetings as it relates to the question of a retaining wall or berm, and that's the information that was outstanding at the last two meetings. Board members, any comments? Brian?
I'm sorry, in terms of public comments, there was a new letter in there that, with a request to be read into the record.
Could I respond to Mr. Hadler's comments first? That's okay.
So there was a letter in there from a resident requesting that it be read into the record.
Is there a letter in the file?
That's everything that's there.
Do you know the name of the resident who was?
No.
I read it also. It was there this morning.
Do you know the name of the resident?
Oh, there it is.
Is this the letter?
Yes.
Okay, please.
Okay. Said regarding 24 and 28 Gin Lane. Dear Chairman and members of the board, the Southampton Association's public service notice in last week's Southampton Press was a startling reminder of just how huge and out of scale this proposal is for its site, unquestionably located in the most beautiful and scenic area of the entire village. It spurred me to go to the buildings department to take a closer look at the plans and elevations of this second design. Although the plan has been repackaged in the more traditional neo-arts and crafts and shingle styles, it is still too big for its location. It is over 200 feet long as it spreads across the site from north to south, and most of it is 2.5 stories high. An attempt has been made to camouflage its length and bulk by breaking up the facade in a series of shallow, projecting gables and pitched roofs and dormers. But as seen from the shore of Lake Agawam and parking lot, it will appear as a huge shingled wall built on top of 4 feet of fill with a 4-foot retaining wall topped with a 6-foot fence. Ed Hollander, the landscape architect, has a drawing which includes the elevations of 28 Gin Lane and 8 and 10 Fairley Road, showing the 3 buildings on the same visual plane. We assume the facades of all 3 buildings are drawn to scale, but we wonder if they are drawn at the correct ground elevations, for we know that 28 Gin Lane will be built on top of 4 feet of fill. In his drawing, 28 Gin Lane appears to be an innocuous building nestled into the landscape, lower in elevation than the houses on Fairley Lane. But because the 3 houses are on different visual planes, we know that in reality, 28 Gin Lane will appear much larger than the Fairley Lane cottages as seen from Lake Agawam. To adequately understand and review the impact of this proposal, it is essential that it be reviewed in the 3rd dimension, i.e. a scale model. It is not unusual for a review board to ask for a scale model. Having listened to Jeffrey Bragman at previous reviews of this project, the ARB has the right to make this request. And for an area of such visual and historical significance to the village, I do not think it an unreasonable request. I urge the ARB to deny this application and to require any future proposals to include a contour model of the site with scale models of adjacent buildings so that it can be adequately reviewed. This, the heart of our village, is too important, too beautiful to all villagers to be squandered simply because we, the village, or its ARB, did not demand the proper tools with which to adequately or competently review this or any other proposal for this particular building site. Yours truly, Richard Cairns.
Thank you.
Can I have his address? His address.
130 Burnett Street.
Totally have no standing. Can I respond to a couple of things Mr. Hadler said, then I'll sit down? Burnett Street is probably a mile and a half.
Respectfully, response. The response is respectfully.
Of course. Yeah, of course. 135 Burnett Street is a mile and a half. That letter, you should disregard it, has no standing, and standing is an administrative issue, as I've given you case law.
If I may,
Right.
this is a public hearing. He is a resident of the village.
Oh, he can
He
put it
is
in.
as entitled
He can-
as
sure he can.
anybody else, and I'm speaking, he is entitled as anybody else in this village to make a statement and not to be dismissed out of hand for doing so. He took the time and effort because he was concerned. I'm not saying that you're not concerned, but please don't be dismissive of other people who live in this village.
I will not dismissive. I will continue to raise that issue as long as I appear before this board. Anybody can put whatever they want in the record. The courts have said what weight you have to give it. And the courts have said, in a case that I litigated up to the Second Department, which is attached to that letter, that standing is an administrative concept as well. Yes, anyone can put anything they want in the letter. And when I say the person person doesn't have standing. If I didn't put that in the record and I didn't bring it to your attention, I would be malpracticing.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Then-
So now, in response to what Mr. Handler said, comments about the wall, as we've demonstrated, the wall had a certificate of occupancy. Mr. Foster has told you why he issued a CO building permit for the wall, but Mr. Bragman at one point admitted on the record that he was aware, his clients were aware of it in January, so he's lost his time to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals to challenge the wall. Regarding the side yard setbacks, the lot is a pre-existing non-conforming lot in terms of width. The 4/10 rule is applicable, and Squires and Holden very specifically showed the building envelope on the lot.
I believe we made comment with regards to side yard setback and zoning as well as
Right.
anything else that had to
There is a sky plane.
Understood.
Okay. And then finally, as it relates to the tennis court, I'm reading from 116-32 procedure for application, which is applications for the Board of Architectural Review and Historic Preservation. So both manners in which you're sitting, both as an ARB and historic preservation. You may have to make an application for a permit for all buildings, structures, et cetera, with the exception of tennis courts and swimming pools. So tennis courts aren't even in your jurisdiction. I'm sure council will inform me of that. That's 116-32D. Thank you.
Excuse me, do you think you could have some ventilation in
Yeah.
here, please? Charlie?
Charlie, you think we can turn the AC on or a fan?
Thank you. People are fanning themselves. I'm hot, too, so,
A lot of hot air.
yeah, please. Thank
All
you.
right, anything further from the public? If this is, okay, is there something more substantive in addition to what you've already discussed?
Richard Handler, 50 Broadway, Amityville. I hope I'm not contributing to the hot air, but thank you for this chance. A couple points about the Secretary's guidelines, and I'd like to share with you, just briefly if I can, a delineation of certain elements from the Federal Code of Regulations, Part 67.7, regarding rehabilitations. And by the way, there's also a separate Secretary of Standards for reconstructions. So that is a Secretary of Standards and guidelines that also exists, as well as the reconstruction guidelines. But as to the rehabilitation guidelines, I want to share 4 principal ones with you if I can. And this is at 36 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 67.7B1. And in there, the Secretary of the Interior, with respect to historic properties or historic districts, cautions, particularly with respect to new work. And the Secretary says, quote, "New work shall be compatible with the massing, size," that's a quote, "scale and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment." That comes from the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, which are statutorily authorized within Chapter 65 of this code. And therefore, where new work is involved, your code, through the Secretary of Interior standards, mandates that when new work is involved, it is compatible in, quote, "massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment." I have great respect for your historic consultant. He has a superior reputation, and this is not meant to criticize or challenge him, but rather just to add to the discourse. Further, those Secretary standards provide that there shall be minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building, site, or environment. And although we're dealing with a new building here, we're also dealing with site and environment. Further, under those standards, that the historic character of the property property, not the structure, will be retained and preserved. The alteration of spaces which characterize that property shall be avoided. And clearly, a significant alteration of spacing is taking place, viewing the location of this structure with the location of the prior historic structures that were on site. Further, and this is quite significant, each property will be recognized, quote, as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development shall not be undertaken. I was quite taken by the comments of the applicant's architect, which were repeated by others at the not the last hearing, but the prior hearing, where the plan regarding the extension off the main house leading toward the garage was touted as being an excellent example of the development of additions to property over the years, and that the reduction in the roof line and the changing of the dimensions leading up to the garage where that hyphen was a good example, because it provided an opportunity to look as if the property had gained changes over the years. That concept runs totally counter with the Secretary's standards, where the Secretary says it's standard B3 of Part 67, each property is recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development shall not be undertaken. Well, if indeed the planning or architectural idea of having the extension on the northerly portion of the house give the impression of additions over the years, that certainly violates the Secretary's standards. As far as the Secretary's guidelines, which are also expressly incorporated within your code, the Secretary takes great strides at discussing landscape, recognizing, quote, that landscapes are had functional purposes and are significant in historic, aesthetic, and historic part of history. Fine. But more importantly, the Secretary's guidelines, these are not the standards, these are the guidelines, urge that features shall be retained during rehabilitation. That characteristic features of lawns, this is a quote, lawns, hedges, walks, drives, fences, terraces, water features, topography shall be maintained. These guidelines shout, frankly, on the
the issues that we deal with are one of juggling individual property rights and that of community responsibility. I'd like to build on Attorney Handler's spirit of cooperation, and if I were to see that from the applicant, then I'm inclined not necessarily to make my comments, which could be not necessarily confrontational, but differ from some of the other folks. I mean, I still have issues, as I've shared with you and I've shared with the public, with the size and scale of the west facade. The reductions in the east facade are minor. The roof height is actually a little bit higher than the original design. But rather than going into detail on that, I would wish that the applicant, through his attorney, and it appears that there have been conversations, that we're moving closer. I'm not quite where Brian is. I don't think this is the best. I think it's better. And I think that there have been suggestions that could make it even better and accommodate the community side of that balancing act. If, however, that's not the case, then I'm not inclined to accept the scale of the west facade as it is. I can go into more detail, but I'd rather build on, and if it turns out that there is not cooperation, then I'd ask that you come back to me.
Okay, Christine?
I think, given the challenges of this piece of land and the lot, I think the changes that have been made to the plan are positive. I think it's a good-looking house, and there have definitely been some big issues that have been raised, but I don't see any architectural suggestions that I could make that would improve on what's been done.
Susan?
I still have, as Mr. Bennett said tonight, the size of these buildings in the historic district, which he mentioned many, depend on how they sit on the land. This is unfortunate the way this house sits on this narrow lot. And I feel that the scale of it, and also I do think that the western facade, which is massive and I feel quite unbroken, has too much of an impact on the precarious historic district that we have already. I think the landscaping is not an issue, but I do feel that it is too much of an impact. And I would also add that I asked repeatedly to have the architects or their historic consultant tell me how the aspects of this house relate to Fairleigh and to the Betts houses, and I have never had an answer. I don't think they do. I don't think it does, except that it has shingles on it, but that's my feeling. Like oyster shell stucco is in the train station. I don't think it's anywhere else in the residential use. Here?
Yes, it is. It's in the Tim Haynes house that this board approved on.
Well, I mean historic.
Yes, historic. Yeah, it's a very well-known East End architectural detail.
I know that, but I'm asking about in the particular area where it exists.
All seen that land. It's a Tim Haynes redo of a house. It had the Tree of Life timber facade on it. This stucco and the oyster shell or clam shell, whatever it is.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's clams or oysters to me. Okay. So I have misgivings. And I would love to hear how it relates to the Fairleigh houses are simpler. They have a kind of individuality that's amazing to me. And I think aspects of this house relate to Walden Manor, which was redone. The curve over the door, the plaster, that is really not the best example of the historic district. It's a redo of a beach house that was it is there, but I'm not even sure it would be considered so historic if we got into it in a big way. So to me, how it sits on the land has a lot to do, regarding Fairleigh is a real issue.
Coming into this meeting, I went back to the original application so many months back, because I kind of forgot. I mean, that's how much we've gone over different evaluations, changes, adjustments, reductions, and quite frankly, what I saw then and what I see now is I see what this board is all about. And that's looking at an application, not that we're redesigning and our responsibility is to redesign anyone's home, but using the process, listening to the community, listening to some of the concerned citizens. I mean, you've seen them time and time. They've come here, they've invested their time. Some have probably taken days off of work or at least spent extra days out here in order for their voice to be heard in the process. And quite frankly, I think that happened. What happened is you saw a reduction in the in the home. You saw a change in the facade of the house. You've seen an adjustment in the overall vernacular of the house. You saw, and then when it got to the appropriateness, which was at the last meeting, also adjusted and substantiated by Zach Student-Ross report. There's an additional reduction of 23.5 feet. I think the issue is a lot more than just looking at overall design. There may be some changes in our overall policy and on the village's guidelines to help us view some of these homes and the scale overall. But in this particular application, where the house fits into all of the envelope and footprint of the house and has additionally had concessions of reduction over time, and I think we are at a point now where there's nothing more that can be done to improve this than where we currently are. And I'm prepared and more than prepared and feel comfortable moving forward on the application. At least closing for discussion. I lead the council in terms of any additional information to be received after the fact. That was a request of one of the council to just add to the overall file. But I think there's nothing more substantive that can be added to this file at this point. I think the file is complete, and just for purposes of closing the application, for our board to come to consensus to discuss with you what our written decision would be.
You may respond, but I object to what the chair said.
Mr. Handler, what time would you need for your summary memorandum?
Yes, thank you. I know Mr. Microphone, sir. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Robinson. I know Mr. Bragman, who apologized for not being here, a unavoidable commitment, would want to submit memoranda. I would ask that perhaps 30 days be acceptable. I'm sure Mr. Bennett may have some concern about that, but that's my initial request.
If I may? If I may?
Yes, sure.
Okay. I don't see the need whatsoever for any sort of written submission. I have never seen the board ask for a written submission. There's no legal arguments to be made here. The House complies. There's absolutely no need whatsoever for any sort of memorandum. Mr. Handler took a position about some action by this board. I responded. That's all been done. This is an aesthetic board. It's not a board that is supposed to review legal memoranda. All of what you have in front of you is part of the application and the supplements to the application. I have never seen this board ever do anything other than close the meeting or continue it or close it, and it should be closed. And there's no need for it. This is not like a zoning board of appeals where you have further legal arguments or something like that. Close the meeting.
Do you wish to submit anything further in writing?
No, absolutely not. No. I think this is just another gambit to buy time. Since November we've been here. It has been, essentially I've been negotiating with myself since November.
I get your point, John.
Thank you.
Mr. Handler, given the fact that this design essentially has been around for more than a month, and these issues have been battered back and forth for at least 2 meetings. You think you, Mr. Bragdon, can get what you want to say done in 2 weeks?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I do think that there are questions. I recited the certain elements of the Secretary of Interior guidelines and standards, references to the criteria, the additional criteria for which this board is mandated to consider, and to that extent, the submission of memoranda on that point would be appreciated. Thank you very much.
Can I interject?
Please.
I feel like a broken record, but just give me a minute. The Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines, and you, sir, used the word 3 or 4 times, deal with rehabilitation. That not only implies, but actually expresses and limits all of that wisdom to pre-existing buildings. You quoted Julian Adams in his Landmarker magazine. He's a colleague of mine who used to be the editor of that magazine that came out of the State Historic Preservation Office. Fortunately, he's discontinued that. Very good ideas. He was opining on how he thinks those standards could possibly and might benefit a discussion of new design. But that is his opinion. The fact is that the standards apply to rehabilitation, and that means pre-existing buildings. And there's a good reason for that. Our own guidelines address that. When we have new construction, which means additions, or perhaps a new structure, or a new landscape, being introduced to a pre-existing, recognized, designated historic contributing site, it is important that this board exercise its diligence in terms of ensuring that the new design work, the new construction, the new scale, the new detailing, the new trees do not sufficiently disrupt or disguise or eradicate that which is historically significant because it's already there. It's not about introducing new designs to new lots.
Than those who are here. And I get back to what I was saying before, that there's, perhaps during those 14 days, that if your applicant, John, was so inclined to have the meetings that...
Not so inclined.
Well, then...
Done. Over.
Then I would not vote for closing this meeting then, because I don't think that sort of attitude necessarily helps. I think Mr. Handler put forward half a dozen things. Yes, some of them were legal, some of them were technical, and those may be issues that come up in the Article 78 filing and so on. But there was also the request, and there was, apparently you folks have been talking. All I'm asking for is, rather than closing a session so that we get into, John, just wait 1 second.
I'm not saying that.
Okay. That rather than getting into a legal pissing match, for a lack of a better word, that we give the community and the applicant one more chance. I mean, we're talking about less than 30 feet here in some cases. We're talking about designs. We're talking about privacy. We're talking about a pool house that wasn't on the original design and things of that nature. So rather than make it adversarial, let's make it communal.
You can't please someone who doesn't want to be pleased.
You're making
And
a
that's
gross
what-
assumption.
No.
John,
I have
you're making
given-
a gross
given-
assumption.
Please, I'm
and
speaking now,
no,
Mr. Broadley.
When you speak rudely, I
I'm
will not
speaking
listen
now,
to
Mr.
you.
Broadley.
Okay?
Well, yes,
When you
no,
speak-
actually, you're doing
Yes,
this to
right.
me.
That's actually not the appropriate response. When they're,
I agree
when
with you.
anyone's listening, when anyone's speaking, there always should be a listening ear,
I
especially
agree.
on our boards, essentially. You can have a disagreement, and we do have that at times, but we have to have a listening ear, as well as the public, as well as the applicant. So let's just, go ahead, please.
The new plan was put into the file when? I was there.
You
Was
saw it
that
on Thursday.
Wednesday.
Wednesday at
You went through it.
3:45. That gives people Thursday, Friday, and Monday.
Oh, the plan-
I personally, Mr. Bennett, believe that the public has every right to review these plans and the community. And 3 days, when the building department is open from 9 to 4, is not a whole lot of time, nor do they know, for instance, when these new plans arrive. I have come to assume that you will put them in either on Wednesday at 3:45 or Thursday at 3:45, which is what you usually do for whatever reason.
Don't do anything.
But let me finish. I would hope that the public would have access to everything in the file. I was handed letters, all kinds of things today here, where I'm supposed to be listening to testimony, and I actually think that it's a big load. Why should I have to read it while someone else is talking? I'd like time to know about it, too. So I would ask if maybe that is a meeting on September 11th, is it not?
It's closed this week.
I don't, September 11th.
Well, it says adjourned till September 11th on 472 First Neck
That's
Lane.
correct.
So
There's a
I would
meeting on
have to
September
assume that that's a meeting. Would it be possible to leave it open for the public to have access to the materials? I think that is
Well,
Otherwise, what we're-
let's just, the public would have access to the materials, but submitting more information would not be acceptable except from council up until September 11th. So that's,
So the public can't look at, who didn't have a chance to look at the plans and wants to comment, or the neighbors or whoever?
Well, I believe the nature of the comments thus far have always been about mass. Is there anything in addition to the conversation about mass that the community or
I
neighbors
can't
would have?
presuppose what other people will
So-
say.
Understood. I think that the file at this point has been completed. If the applicants, or I'm sorry, if the community wishes to go into the building department to review any portion of the file, they have the right to do so at any point and any time to do so. There also is, as Jeff so accurately stated, there is an administrative process if they don't even agree with the board's decision. And that process is the Article 78, which there have been people who have exercised over a period of time. But at this point, there has to be an even-handed process for any application, both for the community and for also the
Agreed.
applicant.
That's all I was
And
saying.
we have been weighing very heavily on the community's concerns. This board has done so. Maybe even a little bit to a fault, because we've exhausted pretty much our opportunity to weigh in, because we're listening to feedback from community more so at times. At this point, we've given as much information, we've been given as much information I think that's possible in this file. It's complete. Anything more than that would just be I question even arbitrary to the applicant.
I'm not arguing that it's not complete, I'm just arguing that the public has the right to look at it.
And I'm saying that I'd like the dialogue to continue.
Brian, any questions?
No.
Any questions? Any further public comment? Anything further from council? All right. In that case, that the motion, if there were to be a motion this evening, it would be the motion to close the application with the acceptance of additional information from council, Mr. Handler, to close the business on September 11th.
You could make that motion.
Okay. A motion would be to close the application for both.
Purposes,
For all purposes.
subject to
And it would be subject to submission
by
by Mr. Handler.
Mr. Handler's office.
Close of business on September 11th of 2017 for applications for SH24 LLC, that's 24 Gin Lane, and SH28 LLC, that's 28 Gin Lane. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Nay.
Nay.
Thank you.
I'm sure there's going to be movement. I'm going to take a 5-minute recess.